Welcome, Daisy Ginsberg, on this conversation for OpenEnded. We're super, super thrilled to have you and someone that I admire on so many levels. So thank you so much for joining us.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, so thank you for having me.
Amazing. Okay, so to remind people, OpenEnded is a platform for designers and thinkers around the world. We will explore the spaces where creativity, culture, and design intersect with tech, science, and engineering with a lens on challenging existing structures and perspectives. So we're bringing together a diverse community of creators and activists together through this initiative for design thinking. And somebody who really does embody a lot of our values is Daisy. We obviously know her work very well as a team. We've been following along, and I've been lucky enough to have had overlap with her in Google World as well as in our roles at the Architectural Association, where we kind of accidentally both found ourselves last year. So I'll give a quick intro on Daisy, and I think it's better to have a conversation with her because her work is so expansive. So Dr. Daisy Ginsberg is an artist examining our fraught relationships with nature and technology. She has created artwork, she writes, she's done a lot of curatorial work, and she is, of course, a trained architect, famously.
No, not trained, just done 1 degree.
She's a 1 degree architect. I should, as a professor of architecture now, I should be better at this. And her work explores subjects ranging from artificial intelligence to exobiology, synthetic biology, which I've been reading about a lot today, biodiversity, evolution. And the one theme that keeps resonating throughout her work and her talks is this idea of better and how we can think about, as humans, bettering the world and what that even means. So I'm actually, there's can go on and on in terms of your achievements. But Daisy, I did want to start with where you're at right now. I mean, this has been a year, and I believe you're currently in the countryside in England.
Yeah, I'm so business on the top half, mud on the bottom half right now. So
When did you
I'm
when did you move?
we came out here before the lockdown, so we have my partner and I have a little country cottage we've been renting for the last couple of years as an experiment to see if we could actually commute to London from just outside. And when lockdown happened, we thought, would we rather be in the middle of London, or let's go be feral. And it's been a really wonderful thing. I grew up in London and then in the countryside, and so for me, being in the woods is a second home. And I would never have imagined that we would spend 9 months so far here. So my studio's in London. We go in occasionally. I kind of now go to London and sort of look at the buildings and think it's the most amazing thing, which is a very good way to see London. And I miss the city, but I also like being covered in mud. So it's been very good.
I mean, it's kind of incredible to this year. I feel that being in nature and outside cities has become, in some ways, a sign of privilege, and in some ways a manifestation of it, at least in sort of westernized or wealthy countries, this sense of having the right to leave the city. And I wonder if it's something you've thought about at all. We have been able to step away from the oppression of big buildings and the harshness of cities. We've had the option to in this era of COVID, which wasn't the case, even a few years ago, and people are leaving cities across the US. As someone who cares about architecture and I know cities, is that something you've been thinking about?
A lot. I mean, we have been so fortunate to be able to do this and have the means to do it, and it's deeply problematic in many ways. And the privilege of the access to nature that's a horror in itself. That's a privilege, and it shouldn't be. And where we live in London, in the centre of London, sort of at the east of Bloomsbury, there's not really any parks. There's not nature. And so I go to my studio in Somerset House. I'm able to walk there again. I'm so fortunate to be able to do that. And I don't experience nature. And I make work about our relationship with nature. And I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable and disconnected. So we made this move. But it is terrible how this is the what COVID has revealed is that those who can are leaving the cities, and I'm finding a lot of my friends are planning to move out, have found ways to be outside the city, return to their parents' homes with their kids, even to be in lockdown outside of London. And that's a huge problem, that we have not got access to, when the only service that you can get during lockdown, gyms and entertainment and galleries and all the things we normally do for entertainment are closed, nature becomes the only thing, and a lot of people don't have access to it.
I was Googling, I should just say this, because I Googled synthetic biology, and I'm going to read the definition. It's because, and correct me if it's wrong, it's from genome.com. Synthetic biology is a field of science that involves redesigning organisms for useful purposes by engineering them to have new abilities. Synthetic biology researchers and companies around the world are harnessing the power of nature to solve problems in medicine, manufacturing, and agriculture. So my question for you is, how did you get into this field? And also, what is your team? Who's in your team in your studio right now?
The first question is how I get into that. Well, it's more like just you reading that description. To me, it just sets off all sorts of like the curiosity radar goes off. And when I first learned about it at the beginning of 2008 from my friend and collaborator Sasha Poflep, who died last year, and he'd heard Drew Endy speaking in a basement in Berlin over the Christmas holiday, and we'd just started our MAs at the Royal College of Art in Design Interactions. And he was like, Daisy, I heard about this thing and I think you're gonna love it. And he told me, he's like, this engineer is talking about coding with biology, and anyone's going to be able to do it, and they'll be able to make like organisms do useful things. And I was like, but that sounds like design. That's so weird. And that's really what got me interested. It's like, well, if engineers are becoming biologists and biologists are becoming designers, and we're training to be designers, albeit in a critical way, what on earth are designers going to be doing if we're harnessing nature to make useful things? And then also, why are we engineering nature to be useful to humans? Why don't we just let it be? Like, what right do we have? And there's that paradox, that uncomfortable sort of ethical dilemma that also fascinates me. Why did I have a natural revulsion to this idea? What was it that stirred me to feel uncomfortable, but at the same time hugely intrigued and excited about the possibilities? And that was in 2008, and it took over my life. I decided to explore it for the rest of my masters, and then ended up working with Drew Endy on the synthetic aesthetics project, where we brought artists and designers into synthetic biology, and then put the synthetic biologists into artists and designers studios through 6 paired residencies. We wrote a book about that, which is published by MIT Press. And this is like a mad, it's like a mad project, because it was science research funding, and we were really experimenting with some fundamental questions of like, can you engineer life? Should you engineer life, and how do you do it well? And asking artists and designers and synthetic biologists to explore this in dialogue for no purpose other than asking these questions. So not for public engagement, not to persuade people that this is a good thing, but really trying to find new ways of challenging and exploring these questions. So that really, there was so much possibility when I got into the field, because it was so new. The field really only started around 1999, 2000, and was, very small, sort of slightly fringe area. And now, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So I was so lucky to get involved when things were just sort of starting to kind of move forward. And now, I work with Christina Agapakis, who's a friend and is the creative director of a biotech company. I mean, like, the idea of a creative director of a biotech company is anathema. Like, that's a new thing. And so this whole space that I've been part of and helped, in a way to to initiate is something I'm really proud of, but also is problematic, and it's something I've written about as well. And the second question is, what does my studio look like? Well, at the moment, it's a work from home situation. But I was really hit hard by the pandemic. So I finished my PhD a couple of years ago and decided to really experiment with making bigger projects. I'd written a lot in my PhD and wanted to test out some of the ideas I'd had. So I got together a team. I started working with Ginkgo Bioworks on this incredible project in collaboration with Cecil Tollas, the smell artist, where we brought back the smell of extinct flowers. And we exhibited that in sort of 10 or 15 shows last year. So it was a really intense couple of years. And then the pandemic hit and everything was cancelled or postponed. So very sadly, I had to let go of my team. And now I'm working on this new commission, which is hugely exciting for the Eden project in Cornwall in the UK, and working with Google Arts and Culture and the Gaia Foundation and Garfield Weston Foundation, who are the main sponsors. And so I've got a freelance team working with all sorts of amazing partners.
I actually thought it would be nice for you to talk a little bit about, what is the Eden Project? And of course, I've been hearing about, the beginnings of your collaboration with Google Arts and Culture a few years ago. And it's been like this slow and kind of generative discussion and process. And it's obviously informed your own thinking around what you wanted to achieve. And I was curious about that, because I know you have so many various initiatives going on. And I should point out, because we counted for 2020 of 13 projects listed, 4 for 2021, despite the pandemic. And then each of them has from what we can understand, new bodies of work and research, not just like repetition and the same rhino popping up everywhere, even though it's an amazing rhino. And so that I'm curious about this process with this particular project, and maybe it'll expose a little bit of how you work and how you think.
So we're designing an algorithm that will optimize the planting for pollinators rather than human aesthetics. So what does a garden look like if you're not deciding how it looks, and instead making it as easy and rich as possible for different pollinators to find food and pollinate flowers along the way? And the idea is, pollinators are in enormous decline, and without pollinators, as a species, we're completely up the creek.
And pollinators include all
pollinators, bees. So we all think of bees and honeybees especially, but honeybees are like cattle. They're a farmed product. And there's lots of other insects which are pollinating our crops. So tomatoes, I think tomatoes are only pollinated by bumblebees. And what I didn't know is in the mad research I've been doing, in Australia, there aren't bumblebees. They have to be specially imported into enclosed environments to pollinate tomatoes, because otherwise it has to be done by hand. In China, people pollinate plants by hand on farms because the decline of natural pollinators. So pollinators can be birds, they can be bees, they can be bumblebees, which kind of bee, they can be moths, they can be bats, they can be there's a huge amount of things that are pollinating. And some plants are promiscuous and anything goes, and some plants are incredibly specialized, like the foxglove, which requires a long-tongued bumblebee that can get its tongue all the way in. And all these creatures are being threatened by our actions, and numbers are crashing.
And so what will it be? What are you designing?
So it's going to be a garden, but I'm not designing it, I've never designed a garden. And the first garden I'm designing, I'm not actually designing, because we're designing an algorithm that's going to create pathways through the planting that will enable different species to get their forage really easily. We're also, what we are designing is a curated palette of plants, and each plant has been selected because it's very, there's like research that backs up this is actually good for pollinators. So things I also didn't know is a lot of the flowers we see in our gardens are cultivars, which means they've been bred by humans to look prettier or smell prettier. And that often means that they aren't as good for pollinators, because the plant's putting all its energy in maybe making more petals, and so it's making less nectar. and it's not useful. So we're selecting plants, working with Eden and different pollinator experts like Dave Goulson and Mark Carlton, so putting together this list of plants that we like. So there is some aesthetics, but we are creating a range that suits lots of different kinds of pollinators. So there's like a good database. And then the algorithm will select from that and arrange so that we have the most coverage across the year of blooming period. So we're creating a space for different insects which have different periods where they come out, and we're creating diversity. So basically the algorithm will sort everything and create a pattern. And within that, there's also this super amazing thing about bees in particular, is that a bee will visit about 10,000 flowers in a day. So travel time is very important. When the bee leaves the hive for the first time, it goes off exploring and it memorizes the locations of flowers, and it tries different flowers, and it works out, finds one that it knows how to get the nectar from, and then it will look for that kind of flower, and then it will memorize the patches on its route, and it can fly like 5 miles, and then it goes back and visits the same flower, and it optimizes the route. So we're building these optimized routes into the planting design as well, so that a bee can come and find what it likes over and over again. And so you sort of start to visualize the bee flight paths.
I mean, there's something to be said for using artificial intelligence around the flight paths of the bees, and really thinking about consciousness and intelligence outside of humans. And I'm sure this is something you've thought about. Is that, and I'm sure it's kind of manifested in thinking about these animals, but the idea of the human and our intelligence and our own consciousness versus that of non-humans, is that part of your practice right now?
Yeah, and I'm so curious, what does it mean to design for non-humans? And that's why I hope this garden in a way is really ugly, because or really shocking visually in some way, because that will show us that it's not for, or if it's unconventional and some visually unconventional, it will remind us that it's not actually for humans. It's creating a space for other species. It's an artwork for other species. So the next stage is then we begin to put it online, and that's where Google Arts and Culture comes in. And we are building a website, an experiment, where the user will be able to play with the algorithmic planting tool and enter their local conditions, like soil type, pH of the soil. And at the beginning, it will just be for the UK. So they'll be able to access databases that we've selected of UK plants, and they can then play with it and produce a scheme, and then they can go and plant it and have their own edition of the artwork in their garden. Or maybe there's a community space where it could be planted, or you can just explore it online. And then the ambition is to find partners around the world and actually use this as a tool for creative activism. So to create more of these gardens around the world, and by creating them with partners, maybe a botanical garden somewhere else in the world, we can then develop a new plant list for that region through that project. And then people in that region will be able to plant appropriate local flowers in a version of one of these gardens.
That's so incredible. I'm thinking a lot about, generative AI and, cities. And of course, you've heard of Sidewalk Labs, but there's a lot of, I guess, AI work done around how do we build a better city. And there's something so beautiful about, you just hand over power. You take all of that intelligence and you hand it back. And then as humans, we step back and we watch. And we're so used to, that is what it is, right? Synthetic biology, this idea of engaging and then letting go. And I find that
and this is what, for me, like the contrast of what I've done before in this project, it really, we're using technology to do something that we could do in other ways. We could just make space. But there's something really interesting about exploring these themes of letting go, of like not having control of the design. And also, for me, from an artistic sort of research point of view, I'm really excited to make a digital artwork that's printed in flowers. It's not like you plug the screen in to generate the project, but then you can enjoy it And the simulation starts online, but then it actually goes live, and you can watch how this thing behaves over a number of years. So we're using perennials, which are plants that come back each year. So you'll start to see if there's a successful plant that gets pollinated more, it might actually take over. We're trying to choose plants that can live in balance with each other, because these are all things I'm learning about gardening this year, is that a garden will tend to monoculture because some plants are more dominant than others, and they'll take over. So you have all of these, my idea is that people who will play with this and maybe experiment with it might not know anything about gardening or never tried before. And there's something in using the artwork as a vehicle that actually can engage you with AI, engage you with the scariness of garden design, which I'm learning about, and actually give you agency to do something about pollinators, like actually planting a flower bed of the right flowers, of ones that are good for pollinators, is an amazingly beneficial thing to do, especially in an urban environment where there's a dearth of flowers.
But there's a dearth of flowers and all the beauty that comes with it, and you're like, there's just no way that it's going to be ugly. It's going to be different but not ugly. And so, I spent this summer, I was in Pakistan, and I spent a lot of time learning about invasive plant species and helping with clearing of plant species, which I didn't know anything about, and the impact, right, of when there is a species that is dominant but destructive, and it has been sort of brought by whatever, an external force, like the bumblebees in Australia, and what that does to ecosystems and how it throws off a balance.
I'm so interested to hear what you were working on when you were back in Pakistan, because these are really social words, like invasive or aliens. These are the words that we use to describe immigrants, or to sort of denote good and bad. And one of the things, with this project was, should we just be talking about native UK species? What's appropriate? We don't want invasive species coming into the chalk pits, because then it will, take over. And you realize that all these words have this power to them, and they're not the ways that the biological world necessarily operates. So instead, we're talking about locally appropriate. So there are plants from around the world on our list, but they're plants that can operate in balance. So when we start to anthropomorphize plants, you can get into trouble.
Oh, that's so interesting. Thank you for saying that. Okay. And so then I do want to hear about your work, kind of how the Google collaboration and where you see that going. And obviously from an educational perspective, you're empowering anyone around the world to do and to create. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. I'm really super inspired by the fact that as an artist, on the one hand, you're this incredible poster child for empowering yourself with technology and in the space of activism for design. But also you've taken technology as a tool that you can leverage, and you've not made it the outcome always. So in Eden, for example, as part of your process for creating this garden, this park, with locally appropriate species, but also, that's not necessarily just what's coming out of it is something on a website. And for me, that's, when we talk about most of these new technologies, artificial intelligence has been around, of course, and has evolved rapidly, but, our Earth has been around for billions of years, and technologies are changing and manifesting every day. It's really powerful to be able to say, I will use this as a tool for my own practice, as opposed to what we do here is, especially with art, tech, design, does it have a technology element, or how will I be impacted or affected by technology? And for that, I'm curious about how you work with technology over the years and how that's become so integral to your practice, and equally how that affected your collaboration with Eden and Google.
Yeah, it's such an interesting area. So the last 2 years, I've really been incorporating the technology in the project. So before my PhD, so I'd say like 2007 to the work I did like up to 2015, the work was about synthetic biology, and it was deeply informed, and I was working in the field, but I wasn't using synthetic biology to make the outcomes. Since the PhD, I've made the piece Machine Auguries, which was sort of creating the dawn chorus using a GAN, generative adversarial network.
And that's the birds, right?
That's the birds, yes. Yeah. So it's an installation where you hear the dawn chorus being taken over by deep fake birds, essentially. And it's sort of an unsettling but beautiful experience. And the work sort of hopefully brings attention to the loss of birds in urban environments due to noise and sound pollution, which aren't things that we think of as affecting birds. We think of habitat loss. And I was, had never worked with AI, and then approached faculty who are an artificial intelligence company, and was very lucky to be part of their fellowship scheme, and worked with Shemek Vitachik, who's working with me on the Eden pollinator project on the AI, and he's a string theory physicist, and was able to make the magic happen. There's nothing like having a string theory physicist resident in your studio for a summer. And with Resurrecting the Sublime, the flower project that I mentioned, where we brought back the smell of extinct flowers, this was using work by Ginkgo Bioworks, the biotech company in Boston, to take DNA from pressed flower specimens at Harvard and establish, using very advanced computation and synthetic biology techniques, what smell molecules these plants may have produced. And then Sissel Tollas, with all her expertise in her lab in Berlin, in her collaboration with IFF, which is a fragrance molecule company, sort of rebuilding those smells. And then for me, it was like, well, how are we going to smell them in the gallery?
Then, I mean, so we're being humble, but what I would say is, like, it is so powerful, because when you say string physicist or, molecular biologist, how do you communicate? And you can communicate, Daisy, and the sense of, you can take the idea of smell or bird song, and that becomes a central, mechanism to bring these worlds together, is incredible.
Well, it's the not knowing. So I'm very grateful for you saying that. And I feel like I don't know how this stuff works. I learn as much as I can. I can't code. I can't program anything. I tried. I cried when I tried to learn. I went to night school at University of Westminster in beginning of 2007 to learn. I was sitting like out in Harrow trying to learn at night how to do JavaScript. It's like, I need to know something. But what's, again, I said it's really powerful, like not knowing. And I can read a scientific paper, I don't understand it all, but I can ask the questions, and I've made enough friends in science that I can get someone to explain it.
Well, I mean, thank you for saying this, because on the one hand, like, you're so celebrated by your peers and in the world of design, however it's just defined, but actually I think where there is so much value that is probably spoken about less is in your teaching. And I was saying earlier, I was looking at your syllabus from the Architecture Association last year, and I was like, oh my God, I wish I could have taken this class. Like, you're expansive, and you also are opening up new windows, and that is a different way of thinking and doing. So I know we have like no time left, but I was curious a little bit about that course, and in general about your teaching and how you've been structuring your classes so far.
But I haven't done that much teaching. It's so wonderful to hear you liked what we did for DIP 12. So I was teaching with Inigo Mins and Ivor Morrison last year. And our platform was about other worlds, and so otherness and the wilderness. And we had students working on decolonizing museums through to sort of memory archives for migrants, and just like really diverse range of projects. And I think it's maybe useful. So I did a workshop for geodesign, which is the new course that Forma Phantasma have set up at the Design Academy Eindhoven. So a few weeks ago over Zoom, I had to entice the students to think about this problem of more than human design. And it was such fun, because I was trying to get them to create a design that wasn't useful for humans, and with another species as the client. And that's what I love about teaching, because I learned so much from it. These ideas, we kept on having these conversations about care, about empathy, creating empathy for other organisms, and this problem of anthropomorphization. And then we kind of kept on hitting this fundamental problem of what is design? Is design just for humans, or is design, there are other species that design, that create tools, that bowerbirds create amazing structures. We're not the only ones kind of creating things. But what does it mean to have this desire for the future embedded in the things that we create? And if we create things for other species, is a human self-interest always at play? And so I'm really hoping these students, as they go through their masters, will kind of help all of us understand this stuff a bit more, because it feels like a really new space. And in a way, what I'm doing with the pollinator project is this. It's like, what does it mean if we're not the client? And the technology is just the methodology to achieve that, and hopefully a way to disseminate it. And that's part of the idea, is that you can create locally appropriate, diverse results. So you're not making the same thing over and over again, but you can have something unique that's different, but it's all connected in some ways, part of this bigger organism, this web, some network of projects and gardens. And that's, I think, that's what I'm excited about. More and more designers are engaging with these ideas of the more than human, of it's beyond sustainability. It's not about creating more stuff. It's really about understanding, what do we want from the world, and how do we reconnect with the natural world.
So I told you this last time we spoke, is that I'm teaching this class at Central St. Martin's, and we're running around a series of design sprints for the Masters in Architecture first year. And I had this question last week from a student saying, well, what if the end user or the end audience is not a person? And I've spent my entire career thinking about solving for people. And I said, I don't know. And I could see them all looking at me, because he said, well, if we were to solve for something like climate change in a very macro perspective, wouldn't we be solving for the Earth? And I looked at him again and I said, well, I don't know. I have to think about it. And right after that, I had this conversation with you, and I was like, oh my God, like, so much of this is how this, part of it is this massive arrogance that we have as humans. And part of it is this, when you stop thinking outside of your own space. So I found
but that's how we were
students.
taught. And I think that's what one of the wonderful things that I've learned so many wonderful things from the Black Lives Matter movement, and from friends who've been willing to take time to explain and teach me as well, and point me to books and resources, and all the learning that I've had to do. Because also this realization that never occurred to me through my privilege, that the way I was taught architecture was so problematic. I was at Cambridge and taught this sort of Western history of architecture, and it's a white man Western history. And it's a long 20 years ago that I did that degree, but this sort of realization that we've been shaped in this way, and it's really, really restrictive. So when the students at Eindhoven were creating a love song for locusts, or a methodology for breathing on lichen to appreciate them more, or rewilding Amsterdam with beavers and creating pedestrian routes around them. And it's a really challenging thing, and it's more than just a philosophical exercise. It's really like, well, why don't we stop and look at lichen? Why don't we why don't we sing love songs for locusts? Locusts are super destructive and problematic, and destroy crops, and that's why we don't sing love songs.
Exactly.
But how do we shift our perspective? And our perspective, I have been trained in this very classical, British, methodology of architecture, of my earlier schooling, and I'm always learning more. And that's I think, also I love the way you speak as well, and it's something I've learnt from some of the people I admire the most, is this ability to say, well, I was wrong. and I didn't know that, or I have to go and think about that. And like the ability to change our minds, and that's what's been so we've seen in the US this year and elsewhere, that we need to change our ways. We're going to have to admit we were wrong, that the way we've been living is wrong, and the behaving.
Yeah. So I really wanted to talk about two things, which I will put in the newsletter. And one is the rhino and DeepMind, because you've spoken so interestingly about this paradoxity with humans not looking after what already exists on this earth, but being so desperate to develop new ways of creating intelligence. And the second is looking at life on Mars, the wilding of Mars, and the same story of the non-human perspective to what does it mean to have life.
And both of those projects are, in a way, especially the substitute, the sort of reconstruction of this northern white rhino and also resurrecting the sublime. All of them were like, can you make the human the subject in some ways? So the rhino is looking back at us, and in the gallery you feel sort of scrutinized.
Incredible.
And in resurrecting the sublime, the human ends up inside the display case and suddenly realizes that they're being looked at. And the wilding of Mars, we're looking at plants on another planet without humans, and that's a challenge to this colonial. Why are we talking about colonizing Mars? Like, colonization is not good for many humans and many species. So why are we talking about colonizing Mars? So why would it be humans? Why not just send plants and let them create their own life and destroy indigenous life in the process, potentially? So it's still a violent act.
Yeah, and what goes around comes around, right? For the people, it benefits in the short run. Okay, so I am going to ask our final question. I could talk to you for ages. Obviously, I'm sure anyone could. But the question is, what is, we ask all of our guests on OpenEnded about one radical idea or dream they have for the future. And Daisy, you have been working through many radical dreams for the future. So I wonder how much of a challenge this is. But is there anything that you have yet to work on that you have somewhere sort of laid out for next year or the future that you would really like to achieve, or just a dream that you have for the world?
Dream I think for all of us, just remembering that we have one planet, and it's without it we're pretty much not going anywhere. So what is it? We dream of this better world, this better future, but who gets to define that? How do we define that together? Who gets to say, who should we be learning from? Which of the indigenous cultures, peoples, experts, people already living how we should be living in terms of respect for our environment? So maybe it's as simple as how do we crack open this idea that we're somehow separate from our natural world and get us back into it, whilst creating this balance between all the benefits that modernity has brought for many people, but not for all, of course. I don't know. I think the better future is probably got more mud.
Super radical. I know. That's incredible. Well, I mean,
it's a bit big. That's the problem. Shorter term, let's get through to 2021 and not burn the planet.
I know. Let's be kind to each other, and as you said, to other species. Okay, so Daisy, thank you so much for joining us. It means a lot.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah, it's been super, and I'm so excited that you've brought this platform together, and the people that I feel very fortunate to be part of this lineup, because there's just amazing people that you're finding from all over the world, and voices that aren't heard enough in our little closed design worlds in the UK, in the US, and Europe. So please carry on teaching us.